My father raised his crystal glass, the expensive champagne catching the light, and looked right at me. "We only invited you out of pity," he said loudly. "Don't stay long." Beside him, my sister laughed, wiping a fake tear. "You really are a failure. They brought me to their New Year's dinner just to humiliate me in front of their wealthy friends." I didn't scream. I just smiled, took a slow sip of my drink, and quietly walked out the door. What they didn't know was that I had the deed, the recordings, and the power to freeze their entire fake empire. 1 week later, the family cabin was sold. Their joint accounts were locked, and the bank statements started arriving. Before I tell you how their whole world collapsed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. I was sitting on the floor of my cramped Boston apartment, surrounded by stacks of yellowed archival documents. The radiator in the corner was clanking rhythmically, fighting a completely losing battle against the bitter December wind that was rattling the single-pane windows of my living room. My hands were dry and cracked from handling centuries-old paper all day at the museum, where I worked as a provenance researcher. It was a job I deeply loved, a job dedicated to protecting history and ensuring stolen artifacts were returned to their rightful owners. But my family never missed an opportunity to remind me that my salary barely covered the rent in a decent zip code, let alone afforded the luxury lifestyle they believed was our birthright. I reached for my mug of black coffee, my eyes burning from staring at the fine print of an 18th century shipping manifest, when I heard the sharp, metallic snap of the mail slot on my front door. A small pile of letters hit the entryway floor with a soft thud. I pushed myself up, my knees popping slightly in the cold apartment, and walked over. Amidst the brightly colored junk mail flyers and a past-due electric bill was a thick, cream-colored envelope. I recognized the heavy, expensive cardstock immediately. It was the exact kind of textured paper that people with old money use when they want their cruelty to look perfectly elegant. There was no handwritten address, no personal touch at all. Just my name, Claire Holloway, printed in crisp, black, machine-generated calligraphy. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. I didn't even need to open it to know what was inside, but I slid my thumb under the thick wax seal anyway. It was an invitation to the Holloway family's annual New Year's Eve dinner at the Connecticut estate. There was no personal note attached. "No, hope you are doing well, Claire. No, we miss you." Just the location, the time, and a strict formal dress code printed at the bottom. I stared at the heavy cardstock, feeling a familiar, heavy ache settle deep in my chest. My body remembered the anxiety of that massive house long before my mind caught up. That house, with its towering glass conservatory, imported marble floors, and perfectly manicured hedges, had a way of smiling at you while quietly sharpening a hunting knife behind its back. I walked over to the small kitchen counter, tossing the invitation next to the sink. I told myself I wasn't going. I was 29 years old. I was too old, too tired, and too bruised to keep walking into rooms where love was treated like a corporate performance review. Leaning against the cold laminate counter, I closed my eyes, and the memories I usually kept locked tightly away in the back of my mind started bleeding through. 3 years ago, my life had completely unraveled. I went through a brutal, emotionally devastating divorce. My ex-husband, a rising investment banker whom my father absolutely adored and treated more like a son than he ever treated me like a daughter, had decided he wanted a new life. He wanted a life with his much younger, much less opinionated executive assistant. The separation was entirely one-sided, a sudden, violent eviction from my own life and the home we had built together. But the hardest part of that entire nightmare wasn't losing him. The hardest part was the vicious custody battle over our golden retriever, Buster. Buster was the only pure, genuinely good thing in that house, my constant shadow and my only source of comfort during the darkest, loneliest months of my failing marriage. During the legal proceedings, I was an absolute wreck, emotionally drained and financially stretched incredibly thin by lawyer fees. I turned to my family for support. I needed my father to help me secure a decent attorney who wouldn't be bullied by my ex-husband's high-priced legal team. I needed my sister to stand by me in the courtroom. Instead, My father invited my ex-husband to play a round of golf at his exclusive country club the very week the divorce papers were filed. I remember standing in my father's pristine, mahogany-paneled study, tears streaming down my face, begging him to help me keep Buster. My father didn't even bother to look up from his glowing laptop screen. He just adjusted his gold Rolex watch, sighed heavily as if I were a massive inconvenience, and said, "Claire, be reasonable for once in your life. He has the large house with the fenced yard. You're moving into a tiny, depressing apartment. Don't be selfish. Besides, causing a massive legal scene over a dog makes the family look highly unstable to our investors." My own family sided with the man who broke my heart, simply because he looked better on paper and had a higher net worth. They let me lose my dog to protect their pristine social standing. The betrayal was a physical, heavy weight I carried every single day since. After that, I retreated completely. I moved to Boston, threw myself entirely into my museum research, and built a quiet, small, fiercely independent life where no one could ever hurt me again. The only person in that entire bloodline who had ever truly loved me without conditions, without requiring me to prove my worth, was my grandmother. She was the Holloway matriarch, a woman made of absolute iron and quiet grace, who saw right through my father's desperate obsession with wealth and my sister's hollow vanity. When she passed away 2 years ago, the funeral was a grand, theatrical production entirely staged by my father to impress his wealthy business associates and local politicians. I stood in the back row by myself, gripping my cheap black wool coat, crying silent, bitter tears for the only safe harbor I had ever known in this world. A week after the funeral, the estate lawyer called me into his high-rise office for the formal reading of the will. My father and sister were there, sitting on the leather couches, looking bored and highly expectant. They assumed they were getting absolutely everything. But my grandmother knew exactly who they were when no one else was watching. To my father, she left some standard liquid assets. To Vivian, she left her extensive collection of vintage jewelry. But the bulk of her true legacy, the sprawling, beautiful, deeply secluded property in Vermont, the rustic cabin by the lake where we had spent every single summer of my childhood, she left entirely to me. It was a massive inheritance, not just in financial value, but in deep emotional weight. My father was absolutely furious. The veins in his neck popped. He tried to aggressively contest the will right there in the office, claiming I wasn't financially responsible enough to manage such a large property on my meager museum salary. But the paperwork was absolutely ironclad. Over time, because I lived in Boston and the cabin was 4 hours away, and because I was simply too exhausted to fight their constant badgering, a silent, unspoken arrangement fell into place. I held the legal deed, but my father and sister basically took over using the property. They treated it like their own private, exclusive resort, completely ignoring the deeply inconvenient fact that my name was the only one on the legal documents. I opened my eyes, looking at the New Year's invitation sitting on my cheap counter. Why did they even bother to invite me? I knew the real answer. It wasn't because they missed me or wanted family unity. It was because the perfect Holloway family portrait looked incomplete without the struggling, eccentric daughter standing in the background to make everyone else look brighter and more successful by comparison. I gripped the edge of the counter tightly. A small, pathetic, deeply ingrained part of me still hoped. Maybe this time they just wanted a peaceful dinner. Maybe time and distance had finally softened them. Maybe I could just drive down, sit quietly in the back, eat my overpriced food, and go home without suffering a major emotional scratch. I walked into my small bedroom, pulled a simple, well-tailored black dress from the very back of my closet, and laid it carefully on the bed. I was going, but I promised myself as I zipped up the dress and pinned my hair back tightly against my scalp to look presentable, that I would absolutely not let them see me bleed this time. The drive down to Connecticut was long, dark, and bitterly cold. The heater in my 10-year-old Honda Civic struggled to keep the chill out as I drove down Interstate 84. By the time my tires finally crunched onto the long, sweeping, perfectly raked gravel driveway of the Holloway estate, the sky was a deep, bruised winter blue. The massive main house loomed in the distance like a fortress, but the real centerpiece of the night was the conservatory. A massive, custom-built glass and iron structure attached to the west wing. It was glowing brightly from the inside with soft, golden candlelight, looking exactly like a beautiful jewel box designed exclusively to make anyone standing on the outside feel utterly inadequate. I parked near the back, avoiding the line of luxury SUVs and imported sports cars, and walked up the stone steps. I handed my coat to a silent, white-gloved member of the catering staff at the heavy oak front door. The moment I stepped over the threshold into the conservatory, the air completely changed. The physical scent of the room hit me first, a heavy, intoxicating mix of expensive fresh pine garlands, roasted rosemary from the kitchen, melting beeswax candles, and the sharp, clean citrus of the dozens of potted orange trees lining the glass walls. It smelled exactly like generational wealth, and it smelled like 100 terrible childhood memories. There were about 20 or 30 people standing in the room. Business partners, local politicians, and wealthy socialites holding crystal flutes of imported champagne, their voices blending into a low, polished, highly practiced murmur. I stood near the entrance by a large fern for a brief second, closing my eyes and trying to steady my breathing before stepping into the line of fire. Then the invisible shift happened. It always did. The collective, subtle realization rippling through the room that the family outsider had finally arrived. My father, Richard Holloway, was standing near the massive, roaring stone fireplace. He held a heavy crystal tumbler of amber liquid, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit perfectly over his rigid, commanding frame. He was holding court, telling a loud story to two younger men who were nodding with eager, desperate enthusiasm, hanging on to his every word. Beside him stood my younger sister, Vivian. She was draped in a backless cream silk designer gown, her blonde hair falling in perfect, effortless waves over her shoulders. She practically glowed with the arrogant, untouchable confidence of someone who has never once been told no in her entire life. Vivian spotted me first. Her eyes immediately dragged over my plain, sensible black dress, calculating its exact retail cost and finding it severely lacking in a fraction of a second. A brilliant, highly poisonous smile stretched across her perfectly painted face. "Ciele?" she called out, intentionally stretching my name out just enough to make it sound like a tedious inconvenience. "You actually came. We were taking bets." I forced a tight, polite smile, keeping my shoulders back, and walked toward them. "Invitations usually imply that you should show up, Vivian." "Good," my father said, cutting in smoothly before Vivian could respond. He gave me a slow, highly assessing look, starting from my practical, low-heeled shoes and ending at my unadorned neck. For a moment, I thought living in Boston had finally taught you how to avoid unwinnable situations. You look very comfortable, Claire." He didn't yell. My father never yelled in public. His absolute specialty was the quiet, surgical, smiling strike. It was textbook gaslighting wrapped perfectly in a compliment. Vivian laughed softly, a high, tinkling, musical sound that explicitly signaled to the wealthy guests around them that I was the punchline of an inside joke. "I'm perfectly fine, Dad," I said, keeping my voice incredibly level despite the heat rising in my cheeks. "We were just talking about Vivian's massive new promotion," my father said, turning his back slightly to me, redirecting his attention to his captivated audience, dismissing my presence entirely. "Director of Strategy for a global wellness brand. She truly understands value. She understands exactly how to project success to high-net-worth clients." He looked over his shoulder at me, his eyes cold. "How are things down in the dusty basement of the museum, Claire? Still digging through dead people's moldy paperwork? I certainly hope that government salary is finally enough to fix the broken heating in your apartment." A few of the guests chuckled nervously into their champagne glasses, their eyes immediately darting away to the floor to avoid direct eye contact with my public humiliation. My jaw locked tight. I dug my fingernails deep into the soft palm of my hand to stop them from shaking. "Provenance research is incredibly important," I said, my voice steady despite the massive hammer beating wildly in my chest. It stops stolen art and forged history from being sold to museums. Vivian sighed loudly, taking a very delicate sip of her champagne. That always sounds so incredibly noble when you say it fast, Claire. But let's be entirely honest with ourselves. It's a cute hobby, not a real career. Dinner was formally announced shortly after by the head butler. The long dining table was an absolute masterpiece of intimidation. Heavy white linen, heavy antique silver cutlery, and low, flickering candles that forced everyone to look directly toward the center, where my father sat at the head like a medieval king surveying his lesser subjects. I was intentionally seated near the very far end, sandwiched between an elderly, half-deaf board member and a silent, terrified junior executive who looked like he wanted to disappear. The first hour and a half was a grueling masterclass in performative affection. Course after course was silently served by the staff: seared scallops, roasted duck, winter root vegetables, while the entire table was forced to listen to my father and Vivian endlessly stroke each other's massive egos. Then came the dessert service. A rich, dark chocolate tart was placed in front of each of us. The wine had been flowing very heavily all night, and my father's face was slightly flushed. He leaned back in his heavy, carved oak chair, tapping his silver spoon against his china coffee cup to instantly command the table's attention. Absolute silence fell over the room immediately. He looked down the long, intimidating expanse of white linen, his cold eyes locking directly onto mine. You know, he started, his voice carrying easily and clearly over the soft jazz playing quietly in the background. I have to make a bit of a confession to all of you tonight. He gestured toward me with his half-empty wine glass. We only invited Claire out of pity. The room went completely, terrifyingly dead silent. The clinking of silver forks stopped mid-air. The junior executive sitting next to me literally froze, his breath hitching. My father smiled, a completely cold, empty, terrifying expression. I told Vivian earlier today, it would look absolutely terrible if we started the new year without including her at least once. After all, every family has one child who severely struggles to find their footing in the real world. One child who mistakes aimless drifting for independence. The silence stretched out, sharp, heavy, and suffocating. Then, a few guests, completely unsure if they were allowed to be horrified by a billionaire's cruelty, offered nervous, scattered, compliant laughter. It was the sickening sound of social survival. Vivian leaned forward aggressively, resting her bare elbows on the expensive table, her eyes shining with pure malice. "Don't stay long, Claire," she said smoothly, her voice sugary sweet but heavily laced with pure venom. "I know this high level of success must be absolutely exhausting for you to witness up close. Doesn't it ever embarrass you? Walking into rooms like this and knowing deeply that you'll never be the person anyone is actually waiting for." I sat perfectly still. The blood roared violently in my ears. I looked slowly at the wealthy faces around the table. No one was intervening. No one was defending me. They were all willingly watching a blood sport, and I was the designated prey. In fact, Vivian continued loudly, turning her complete attention to a wealthy, older client sitting to her right, completely dismissing me again. "I'm hosting a massive, highly private retreat for our top influencers next month at the family cabin in Vermont. It's the perfect backdrop for our new wellness campaign. The rustic, authentic aesthetic is incredibly on trend right now for our demographic." My father nodded vigorously in agreement. "Yes, the Vermont property is an absolutely excellent asset. I've actually been showing it to the Sullivan Investment Group this week as a prime example of our family's long-term stability and generational wealth. They were openly talking about my cabin, my grandmother's inheritance. They were parading it around in public, selling access to it, building their entire fake corporate empires on the absolute foundation of my property, all while looking me dead in the eye and calling me a pathetic failure. I didn't flush. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, a strange, absolute, terrifying clarity washed over my entire body. the very last remaining string of hope I had for this family. The tiny thread I had held onto for years snapped completely and permanently. I slowly, deliberately set my heavy linen napkin on the table beside my untouched plate. I picked up my crystal water glass, took a slow, incredibly deliberate sip, and set it down on the table without making a single sound. "Excuse me," I said quietly, my voice slicing effortlessly through the heavy tension in the room. I pushed my heavy chair back and stood up. I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on all of them and walked out of the dining room with my spine completely straight. I didn't immediately go to the front door to retrieve my coat. Instead, I walked down the long, heavily carpeted hallway and slipped silently into the estate's massive library. It was the only room in this entire terrifying house I had ever genuinely liked. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves, and the air smelled deeply of old paper, lemon polish, and aged leather. It was completely, beautifully silent in here, a stark, necessary contrast to the echoing cruelty of the dining room I had just escaped. I walked over to the large, leather-topped executive desk sitting near the massive bay window. I needed a moment to breathe, to stop my hands from shaking violently, to collect myself before I drove 4 hours back to Boston. I looked out the dark window into the pitch-black night, watching the bare, skeletal branches of the ancient oak trees scratching wildly against the glass in the winter wind. They hated me. They truly, deeply, fundamentally hated me. But they loved what I legally owned. I leaned heavily against the edge of the desk, resting my cold hands on the smooth leather surface. As I did, my fingers brushed against a thick, open manila folder sitting right next to a brass lamp. My father was incredibly meticulous about his business, but he was also incredibly arrogant. He never bothered to lock his office or put away his papers during parties because he assumed absolutely no one would ever dare enter his personal sanctuary. I looked down. The top document immediately caught my eye. It had the bold, official letterhead of a major commercial banking institution. I knew I shouldn't have looked, but the name printed clearly at the very top of the account summary made my breath catch in my throat. Claire Holloway. I reached out and turned on the small brass desk lamp, pulling the heavy folder closer to the light. My heart began to pound against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape. Underneath the primary bank summary was a thick, stapled stack of highly detailed financial printouts. I started flipping through them quickly, my eyes desperately scanning the rows of numbers and the dense legal jargon. It took me a few minutes to fully piece it together, but when the horrific reality of what I was looking at finally clicked into place in my brain, a massive wave of cold nausea washed over me, making my knees physically weak. Because the massive cabin in Vermont was legally completely in my name, my father and Vivian had aggressively convinced me years ago to open a joint convenience bank account to easily handle the property taxes, the utility bills, and basic maintenance costs. They told me it was just for logistics, so they didn't have to bother me every time a pipe burst. I signed the paperwork at the time, handed them the debit cards, and never looked at the statements again. I foolishly trusted my own blood to pay for what they used. But they hadn't just paid the electric bill. I looked in utter horror at the credit card statements linked directly to that primary convenience account. There were hundreds of thousands of dollars in revolving charges. High-end catering services in New York, private black car services, luxury hotel stays in Europe, expensive spa treatments. Vivian was literally running her entire corporate influencer hospitality budget directly through my personal account to completely hide the massive expenses from her company's strict oversight board. She was committing corporate fraud using my name as a shield. Worse, much worse, I found a secondary, highly confidential file tucked underneath. It was a drafted, near-final proposal for a massive, multi-million-dollar commercial loan my father was desperately trying to secure for his failing global logistics company. He was secretly bleeding cash. And right there, listed explicitly under the informal collateral and asset stability section of his investor pitch deck, was the Vermont cabin. He was actively using the perceived ownership of my property to project massive financial solvency to his skeptical investors. He was building a massive, fragile house of cards on land he did not legally own. There was even a legally binding document detailing a massive college fund for my cousin's kids that my father had publicly promised to pay for to look like a hero, which was completely routed through complex lines of credit heavily secured by the equity of the cabin. I gripped the heavy edge of the desk so hard my knuckles turned completely white and ached. They weren't just using the house for weekend vacations. They were actively, aggressively financially parasitizing me. They were using my clean credit history, my legal ownership, and my quiet, traumatized compliance to fully fund their extravagant, highly fraudulent lives. And then they had the absolute, unbelievable nerve to invite me to a formal dinner just to call me a pathetic charity case in front of their friends. The deep, heavy sadness I had carried for years evaporated in a single, blinding second. It wasn't replaced by explosive, screaming anger. It was replaced by something much more dangerous. Absolute, freezing, terrifying focus. I pulled my cell phone out of my small evening bag and aggressively dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before he answered. "Daniel," I said, my voice completely flat and barely above a whisper. Daniel Mercer was my closest friend from grad school and currently one of the most ruthless, brilliant estate and financial attorneys operating in New York City. "Claire?" He sounded highly surprised. "It's New Year's Eve. Aren't you currently suffering at the Snake Pit in Connecticut?" "I am," I said, staring fiercely at the fraudulent financial documents spread across the desk. "Daniel, I need you to listen to me very carefully right now. You remember the Vermont property? And the joint convenience accounts?" "Of course I do. The ones I practically begged you to close 3 years ago. I want to sell the cabin. Immediately. And I want to sever every single financial tie to those accounts. I want them locked. Right now." There was a brief, heavy pause on the line. Daniel didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't ask if I was being overly emotional. He heard the absolute dead calm in my voice and shifted instantly into aggressive lawyer mode. "If we move extremely fast, we can initiate a total financial lockdown," Daniel said, the rapid clicking of his keyboard immediately starting in the background. "I have a buyer, Eleanor Price. She's a reclusive author who has been looking for a private estate in that exact area for months. She pays in hard cash and she wants absolute discretion. But Claire, listen to me. If you close those active accounts abruptly tonight, any pending luxury charges they have floating out there are going to bounce incredibly hard. It will trigger a massive, immediate financial shockwave across their entire operation." "That is exactly what I want to happen," I said, staring directly at my father's arrogant signature on the highly fraudulent pitch deck. "I don't want to just cut them off gently. I want the entire ground to fall out from under them." "Give me the verbal authorization to execute," Daniel said. "Do it. Activate the blind trust. Lock it all down. Done. Happy New Year, Claire. Give them hell." I hung up the phone. I looked at the documents one last time, carefully making sure they were placed exactly as I had found them so he wouldn't suspect a thing, and turned off the desk lamp. I stood in the dark library for a moment. My hands were no longer shaking at all. I opened the settings on my phone, tapped the voice memo app, and hit the bright red record button. I slipped the phone screen down into the side pocket of my black dress. It was time to go back to the party. I walked slowly back down the long, shadowed hallway, my heels clicking softly and rhythmically against the expensive hardwood floor. I didn't feel like the same weak, frightened woman who had arrived an hour ago. The heavy, suffocating coat of guilt and the desperate, pathetic need for their familial approval had been permanently left in the dark library. I felt incredibly light. I felt incredibly dangerous. I stepped back into the bright dining room. The formal dinner was finally winding down. The wealthy guests were leaning back in their comfortable chairs, sipping strong espresso and laughing loudly at another one of my father's boastful stories. Vivian was carefully touching up her bright red lipstick, looking entirely bored with the people around her. They hadn't even noticed I was gone. They truly, arrogantly believed I had just retreated to a bathroom to cry quietly in a stall, exactly as I was supposed to do. I walked straight over to my empty chair, but I didn't sit down. I reached out, picked up my small evening bag, and slung the delicate gold chain over my shoulder. My father stopped his story mid-sentence and looked up at me, an incredibly annoyed frown creasing his forehead. There you are. We honestly thought you had fled back to your little apartment in Boston. Are you leaving before the midnight toast? I am, I said, my voice incredibly clear and carrying easily across the sudden, heavy silence of the room. But before I go, I wanted to quickly let you know about a major decision I've made regarding my personal assets. Vivian paused, her expensive lipstick tube hovering right near her mouth. She let out a short, highly condescending laugh that echoed in the room. Your assets? What are you talking about, Claire? Are you donating your heavily used car to charity? I looked directly at her, holding her gaze with absolute, unblinking intensity until her arrogant smile slowly started to falter. I'm selling the Vermont cabin, I said completely flatly. If I had pulled a weapon and fired it directly into the expensive crystal chandelier, the physical reaction in the room couldn't have been more violent. Vivian dropped her lipstick in shock. It rolled across the pristine white linen tablecloth, leaving a bright, ugly red smear. My father physically recoiled in his heavy chair, his face instantly draining of all color before flushing a dark, terrifying, furious purple. The wealthy guests around them completely froze, suddenly acutely aware that they were permanently trapped in a vicious family war zone. That's not funny, Claire, Vivian snapped, her voice suddenly shrill and panicked. The polished, elegant persona completely vanished in a second. People are heavily booked there. My company has a massive executive retreat scheduled next month. You can't just joke about selling it. I'm not joking at all, I said, entirely unbothered by her panic. The buyer has already been secured. The legal paperwork is being drafted by my lawyer as we speak. My father stood up violently. The heavy oak chair scraped aggressively against the hardwood floor. He leaned far over the table, his eyes wide and wild, looking exactly like a desperate man who had just realized he stepped on a live landmine. You will do no such thing, he hissed, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural whisper meant to intimidate me. That cabin is family property. It is part of the Holloway legacy. You absolutely do not have the authority to disrupt my sensitive business arrangements. No, Dad, I replied, my voice perfectly steady and ice-cold. It's family mythology. Legally, the deed is solely in my name. You know that. You signed the probate papers at the lawyer's office after the funeral. You know exactly who owns it. You vindictive little bitch. My father spat venomously, losing every single ounce of his refined, aristocratic charm. The wealthy guests looked away, utterly horrified, staring blankly at their dessert plates. Do you have any idea what you're interfering with right now? I am finalizing a major corporate partnership. They are fully expecting access to that property as collateral. Then you shouldn't have built your entire financial stability on collateral you do not legally own, I said, watching the thick vein pulse violently in his neck. Vivian was entirely out of her chair now, rounding the table aggressively toward me. Her eyes were wide with pure terror. Claire, stop this right now. You are insane. You're doing this because you're incredibly jealous of me, because your husband left you and you have absolutely nothing. If you sell that cabin and lock those accounts, my firm will heavily audit my hospitality expenses. I will lose my promotion. I could lose my job. Maybe, I said, looking her up and down with absolute disgust. You should have strongly considered that before you spent tens of thousands of dollars on my credit line to fund your lifestyle, and then told a room full of people that I was a pathetic failure. My father stepped quickly around the table, standing only inches from my face. He tried to use his massive physical size to severely intimidate me, looming over me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Listen to me very carefully, he said, his voice shaking with uncontrollable rage. You are going to walk out into the hallway right now, call whoever you just called, and completely reverse this. Right now. Because if you walk out that front door tonight with this ridiculous plan intact, I swear to God, Claire, I will cut you off completely. You will never use the Holloway name. You will never see a single dime of my money. You will die completely alone. It was the ultimate terrifying threat. The exact threat that kept me quietly obedient for 29 years. The profound fear of total abandonment. But looking at him right now, seeing the raw desperation and the ugly, greedy truth sweating profusely out of his pores, I felt absolutely nothing but profound disgust. I smiled. A real, genuine, deeply satisfied smile. "You can keep the name, Dad," I said quietly, looking him dead in the eye. "I'll keep the deed. And I'll keep the money." I turned firmly on my heel and walked out of the dining room. I didn't run. I took my absolute time. I walked out the heavy front doors of the conservatory and into the freezing, beautiful winter night. The cold air hit my face, clean and incredibly sharp. I reached deep into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and stopped the recording. 8 minutes and 42 seconds of my father and sister explicitly threatening me, openly admitting to using my property for unapproved business leverage, and confirming their full knowledge of the joint accounts. I got into my cheap car, started the engine, and drove slowly down the long gravel driveway. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror a single time. The war was officially declared, but they didn't even realize they had already catastrophically lost. The first morning of the new year arrived in Boston with a bitter, freezing wind that rattled the single-pane windows of my small apartment. Normally, a gray winter morning like this would make me want to pull the heavy covers over my head and hide from the world. But today was entirely different. For the first time in 29 years, I did not wake up with a heavy, sinking feeling in my chest. I did not wake up wondering what my family thought of me, or worrying if I was going to be the target of another passive-aggressive joke. I woke up feeling completely, undeniably awake. The morning after the disastrous New Year's Eve dinner, I did not shed a single tear. I did not pace the floor. I did not pick up my phone to apologize for causing a scene. Instead, I walked into my tiny kitchen, made a strong pot of black coffee, and sat down at my scratched wooden dining table. I opened my laptop and prepared to finalize the complete, systematic dismantling of their financial safety net. True revenge is rarely loud. It isn't found in screaming matches, dramatic television confrontations, or throwing drinks in people's faces. True, lasting power is purely administrative. It lives in spreadsheets, signature lines, and banking portals. It is entirely invisible until it is far too late to stop the momentum. At exactly 9 in the morning, my phone buzzed on the table, vibrating against the wood. It was Daniel, my lawyer. He had spent his entire holiday morning working through the complex legal structures we needed to establish to make this execution flawless. "Good morning, Claire," Daniel said, his voice crisp, alert, and entirely professional. "Are you sitting at your computer? We have a very tight, highly sensitive window to lock this down before the commercial banks open for standard business tomorrow morning. The second your father realizes what you've done, he is going to try and fight dirty." "I have my coffee, and my laptop is open," I replied, clicking the secure email portal link he had just sent over. "Walk me through the exact process." "First, we deal with the Vermont property," Daniel explained, the sound of heavy legal papers shuffling in the background. "Instead of a direct, immediate market sale, which could get incredibly messy if your father tries to aggressively file a frivolous injunction to stall us in court, we are transferring the deed completely out of your personal name. We are moving it directly into an irrevocable blind trust. Eleanor Price, our cash buyer, will lease the property exclusively from the trust for the next 6 months, while the final sale quietly processes in the background." I listened carefully, taking a slow sip of my hot coffee. "What exactly does that mean for them today?" "It means," Daniel said, a hint of deep satisfaction in his tone, "the moment you electronically sign this digital document, you are legally transferring total control to the trust. That means absolutely no one, not even you, can casually grant access to that property. The heavy gate locks are being changed today. A private security firm is already en route to physically secure the perimeter. Your father and Vivian are officially, permanently locked out of their absolute favorite toy." I scrolled down through the dense legal text on my screen. My eyes scanned the complex clauses that officially severed my family's unauthorized access to the only real inheritance I had ever received from my grandmother. I found the highlighted yellow signature line at the very bottom. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I typed my legal name, clicked the accept button, and instantly felt a massive, physical weight lift entirely off my shoulders. Done, I said, my voice steady. The cabin is officially gone. What is our next move? Now comes the part that is going to physically hurt them the most, Daniel said. The joint convenience accounts. I have the direct authorization forms ready to submit to the primary commercial bank. We are instantly freezing and permanently closing all 4 high-limit credit lines currently attached to your name. We are also officially revoking all authorized user privileges for Richard Holloway and Vivian Holloway. I opened the next attached document. This was the exact master account Vivian used to secretly fund her lavish, fake corporate lifestyle. This was also the exact reserve fund my father quietly dipped into whenever his massive logistics company couldn't cover basic vendor invoices. Are you absolutely 100% certain you want to do a hard close today? Daniel asked, pausing for a serious moment to ensure I completely understood the gravity of the action I was about to take. If we do a hard close right now, any pending luxury charges, any scheduled autopays, and any massive deposits they wrote corporate checks against are going to bounce instantly. It will trigger immediate fraud alerts and insufficient funds notices across their entire financial network. It will be an absolute, undeniable financial bloodbath on their end. I sat in silence for a moment, looking out my window at the falling snow. I thought about my father casually telling a room full of wealthy strangers that I was only invited to dinner out of pity. I thought about Vivian looking me dead in the eye and calling me a total failure while she was actively spending my credit limit to buy expensive designer shoes and impress her bosses. I thought about how they both completely abandoned me during my brutal divorce, actively siding with the man who tore my life apart. I thought about how they forced me to lose custody of my dog just to protect their fragile, pristine social image. They never gave me a single warning when they broke my heart. I was absolutely not going to give them a warning when I broke their wallets. Execute the hard close, Daniel, I said, my voice completely cold and unwavering. Shut off every single platinum card. Cancel every single autopay. Drain the reserve line back to 0 and lock the primary routing number. I want the financial umbilical cord completely, permanently severed. Executing right now, Daniel confirmed, the rapid clicking of his keyboard echoing over the phone line. I sat back in my wooden chair and watched the automated digital confirmation receipts flood into my email inbox one by one. Account closed. Access officially revoked. Card permanently terminated. Line of credit frozen. It took exactly 14 minutes to completely undo a decade of hidden financial parasitism. I didn't steal a single dime from my family. I didn't do anything even remotely illegal. I simply packed up the invisible financial scaffolding that had been quietly holding up their fake, glamorous lives and walked away. I closed my laptop, walked over to my living room window, and pressed my hand against the cold glass. I knew exactly what was coming. I knew the massive storm that was quickly gathering over the Connecticut estate, but for the very first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the thunder. I had finally built my own shelter, and they were officially locked outside in the freezing cold. The fallout didn't happen immediately. The real world doesn't move as fast as a movie. It took exactly 7 days for the administrative poison to work its way completely through their fragile, interconnected financial system. But when the dominoes finally started to fall, they crashed with a spectacular, deeply satisfying violence. I didn't have to be physically present in the room to know exactly how it all went down. Between the frantic, screaming voicemails they left on my phone, the aggressive emails from my father's panicked corporate accountants, and the fast-moving, vicious gossip of the wealthy New England social circle, the picture of their destruction was incredibly clear. The first major, catastrophic blow landed squarely on Vivian. It was the first weekend of January. Vivian had proudly driven up to the Vermont mountains with 3 incredibly high-profile wellness influencers and a highly critical senior vice president from her firm. This was supposed to be the massive, exclusive winter retreat she had explicitly bragged about at the New Year's dinner. She had confidently promised them a rustic, highly luxurious weekend at her private family estate to secure a massive brand partnership that would absolutely guarantee her next major corporate promotion. They arrived at the long, winding dirt road leading to the cabin in a sleek fleet of black luxury SUVs. The influencers already had their phones out, ready to film the grand entrance. But when Vivian's private driver pulled up to the main driveway, they didn't find the welcoming, open wrought iron gates they expected. Instead, they found a heavy, industrial-grade steel chain wrapped tightly multiple times around the iron bars, secured by a massive, unbreakable padlock. Nailed directly to the center of the beautiful wooden gate was a bright, neon orange legal notice. It read in bold black letters, "No trespassing. Private property. Asset of the blind trust. All violators will be prosecuted." According to the incredibly panicked, hyperventilating voicemails Vivian left on my phone that afternoon, she had completely lost her mind in front of her important clients. She jumped out of the warm SUV in the freezing snow wearing her expensive designer boots, frantically pulling and screaming at the heavy steel chain. She absolutely humiliated herself in front of the senior vice president of her firm. She desperately tried to call the local estate caretaker on her cell phone, aggressively demanding he open the gate immediately, only to be coldly told that his employment contract had been permanently terminated by a Boston law firm days ago. Desperate to save face and stop the expensive retreat from completely falling apart, Vivian quickly pivoted her strategy. She loudly announced to her guests that there was simply a minor clerical error with the estate manager and immediately redirected the entire group to a famous, five-star luxury ski lodge in the nearby resort town. She confidently marched up to the mahogany front desk, booked 4 of their most expensive premium suites, and casually handed the concierge her shiny corporate expense card, the exact card that was directly linked to my now-closed convenience account. The concierge smiled politely and swiped the card. The machine beeped a harsh red. It declined. He politely apologized and tried to swipe it again. Declined. Code. Account permanently closed. Vivian was standing in the busy, crowded lobby of a luxury hotel, surrounded by incredibly wealthy influencers and her direct boss, completely unable to pay for the rooms she had just loudly promised them. She scrambled through her designer purse to use her personal credit cards. But because she spent every single dime of her salary maintaining her fake, glamorous lifestyle, she didn't have the massive available credit limit required to cover a sudden, unexpected $15,000 luxury hotel bill. The highly anticipated retreat was instantly canceled. The influencers were absolutely furious and immediately posted about the highly disorganized disaster to their millions of followers, tagging Vivian's company. Worse, the senior vice president instantly realized that Vivian had been blatantly lying about owning the family property. He also realized she had been actively committing severe expense fraud by running unapproved corporate hospitality charges through an unauthorized, hidden bank account. By Monday morning, Vivian was forcefully suspended without pay. The massive promotion she had desperately bragged about completely vanished into thin air. Her entire professional career was suddenly hanging by an incredibly tiny, frayed thread. But Vivian's humiliating disaster was small compared to the massive financial earthquake currently hitting my father. Richard Holloway always deeply believed he was the smartest, most untouchable man in any room. He had spent the last 3 years quietly bleeding cash from his global logistics company, desperate to secure a massive new round of funding from the Sullivan Investment Group to keep his entire operation afloat. He had built his entire investor pitch on the absolute illusion of massive, untouchable personal wealth. On Wednesday morning, the Sullivan Group's aggressive legal team requested the final, certified proof of personal assets before signing the multimillion-dollar loan agreement. They specifically requested the updated deed and the current market appraisal for the Vermont property that my father had explicitly listed as informal collateral in his pitch deck. My father confidently called his corporate lawyer to pull the public county records, fully expecting to see my name, assuming he could easily bully me into signing over a property lien later that week. Instead, His lawyer discovered that the property had been entirely transferred into an untouchable blind trust. My father had absolutely zero legal connection to the massive asset he had heavily bragged about to a room full of billionaires. He had explicitly lied on a major, legally binding financial document. The Sullivan Group instantly pulled their massive investment offer off the table, citing a complete, fundamental lack of trust and severe misrepresentation of corporate assets. The panic inside my father's corporate office must have been absolute, unadulterated chaos. Without that massive influx of loan cash, he couldn't cover his aggressive expansion debts. He desperately tried to access the secret reserve fund, the convenience account he had forced me to open years ago, to temporarily cover the bouncing vendor checks. But the reserve fund was completely gone. I had drained the remaining balance to zero and permanently locked the routing number. The large checks he had confidently written to his major international suppliers started bouncing hard across the city. Late payment flags triggered massive, crippling interest rate hikes on his remaining corporate lines of credit. The invisible, highly illegal cushion that had always protected his lavish lifestyle was completely vaporized in a matter of days. The official bank statements started arriving at his massive Connecticut estate. They didn't show the massive wealth he constantly projected. Instead, they showed a terrifying, undeniable string of zero balances, reversed payments, and aggressive account closure notices. The fake, arrogant empire he had spent his entire life building on the backs of other people was finally collapsing, and he was the only one trapped inside the burning building. It happened on a cold, heavily rainy Thursday evening, exactly 9 days after the New Year's dinner. I was sitting comfortably on my couch in Boston, reading a hardcover book and listening to the rain hit the glass, when a heavy, aggressive pounding suddenly started at my front door. It wasn't a polite, normal knock. It was the frantic, violent hammering of someone who was completely losing control of their life. I carefully set my book down, walked slowly over to the door, and looked through the small brass peephole. It was my father and Vivian. They looked absolutely unrecognizable. The polished, aristocratic arrogance they had worn like heavy armor at the dinner party was completely gone. My father's expensive, custom-tailored suit was heavily wrinkled. His silk tie was pulled loose, and his face was flushed a dangerous, mottled red. Vivian looked absolutely wrecked. Her usually perfect hair was wet and heavily tangled from the rain. Her expensive makeup was visibly smudged down her cheeks, and she was shaking with a wild mixture of cold and pure, unadulterated fury. I calmly unlocked the deadbolt and slowly opened the door, deliberately leaving the heavy security chain firmly attached. I looked out at them through the narrow 3-inch gap. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice completely flat, showing absolutely no emotion. "Open this damn door right now, Claire!" my father roared, aggressively grabbing the edge of the wooden door and trying to violently yank it open, only to be stopped hard by the heavy steel chain. "Open this door before I call the police and have them break it down. You're currently trespassing in my building," I said calmly, leaning slightly against the doorframe, totally unbothered by his rage. "Lower your voice immediately, or I will gladly call building security and have you both escorted out to the street in handcuffs. You ruined absolutely everything," Vivian screamed, pushing her way in front of my father, heavy tears of pure rage streaming down her face. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me? My firm officially suspended me. The board of directors is conducting a massive investigation into my expense reports. They are aggressively questioning every single client retreat I ever hosted. You completely destroyed my promotion. You destroyed my entire life." "I didn't destroy anything, Vivian," I replied casually, looking directly into her wide, panicked eyes. "You destroyed your own career the exact moment you decided to commit severe corporate expense fraud using a credit card that didn't belong to you. I simply closed an account that was legally mine. What you chose to illegally charge to it is entirely your problem, not mine. You stupid, vindictive little girl." My father spat, his voice shaking with absolute rage. He leaned incredibly close to the gap in the door, his heavy breath smelling strongly of expensive scotch and raw desperation. The Sullivan Group completely pulled out. My entire logistics company is facing a severe liquidity crisis because of your ridiculous, emotional stunt. You are going to call your lawyer right now. You are going to aggressively reverse that trust transfer, and you are going to reopen those credit lines, or I swear to God, I will completely destroy your reputation. I will hire a massive team of ruthless lawyers to drag you through the mud until you lose that pathetic museum job. I looked at him, studying the desperate, sweating face of the man who was supposed to love and protect me. I didn't feel intimidated. I didn't feel small. I felt incredibly, undeniably powerful. Drag me through the mud? I asked, letting out a short, completely cold laugh. You want to talk about aggressively destroying lives? Let's talk about my divorce, Dad. Let's talk about how you aggressively protected a cheating investment banker because he was good for your precious golf club connections. Let's talk about how you actively helped him secure full custody of Buster, breaking my heart into a million pieces, just because you thought a messy legal fight would temporarily embarrass you at the country club. You have been financially and emotionally bleeding me dry for years, and the absolute second I stop quietly subsidizing your fraudulent life, you call me vindictive. You owe this family, my father yelled, slamming his heavy fist violently against the doorframe. You owe us your loyalty. I owe you absolutely nothing, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet, sharp whisper. Vivian lunged forward, trying to aggressively reach her hand through the narrow gap in the door to grab the collar of my shirt. I will literally kill you, Claire. I swear I will. Stop, I commanded, my voice sharp and loud enough to make her instantly freeze in her tracks. I calmly reached into the pocket of my sweater and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen, opened the voice memo app, and turned the volume all the way up to maximum. I pressed play. The crystal-clear audio from the New Year's Eve dinner filled the quiet, echoing hallway. We only invited you out of pity. Don't stay long, Claire. I know this level of success must be exhausting for you to witness. That cabin is family property. I am finalizing a major corporate partnership. They are fully expecting access to that property as collateral. If you sell that cabin and lock those accounts, my firm will heavily audit my hospitality expenses. I will lose my promotion. I let the recording play just long enough for them to hear their own arrogant, highly incriminating words echoing loudly in the hallway. Then I pressed pause. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. All the explosive anger completely drained out of my father's flushed face, instantly replaced by stark, paralyzing, wide-eyed terror. Vivian stumbled backward away from the door, covering her mouth with her trembling hand, realizing exactly what she had confessed to on tape. That is an 8-minute recording of you both explicitly admitting to severe financial fraud, misrepresentation of corporate assets, and aggressive extortion, I said, looking at them with absolutely zero pity. I have already sent secure digital copies to Daniel, and I have backed it up to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers. My father opened his mouth to speak, to try and bargain, but no words came out. He looked exactly like a deflated balloon. Here is exactly what is going to happen now, I said, firmly dictating the absolute terms of their surrender. You are going to turn around, walk out of this building, and drive back to Connecticut. You are going to clean up your own massive financial messes without ever using my name again. Because if you ever threaten me again, if you ever send a lawyer my way, or if you ever try to contact me for the rest of your miserable lives, this highly explicit audio file will instantly be on the desk of the IRS Fraud Division, the Sullivan Investment Group, and the strict board of directors at Vivian's firm. Do you completely understand me? They stared at me, completely and utterly broken. The massive, intimidating Holloway empire had been completely brought to its knees by the daughter they firmly thought was a failure. My father swallowed hard, his heavy shoulders slumping in total, undeniable defeat. He didn't say a single word. He just slowly turned around and walked heavily down the hallway toward the elevator. Vivian lingered for a second, looking at me with a wild mixture of pure hatred and absolute, genuine fear, before turning and running after him into the shadows. I watched them step into the elevator together, the metal doors sliding shut to completely hide their ruined faces. I reached up, removed the heavy steel chain, and quietly closed my front door, locking the deadbolt with a satisfying, permanent click. Several months have slowly passed since that highly dramatic, rainy night in Boston. The transition wasn't an explosive movie ending with fireworks. It was a slow, quiet, peaceful settling of reality. I read the financial news occasionally, just to keep an eye on the massive ripples I caused in their world. My father's massive global logistics company didn't go completely bankrupt, but the severe liquidity crisis aggressively forced his hand. He had to quickly sell off 40% of his heavily guarded personal shares to a rival private equity firm just to cover his massive debts and keep the doors open. He was no longer the undisputed king of his own corporate boardroom. He was just another stressed, aging executive desperately answering to angry shareholders. His massive Connecticut estate, the site of the dinner party, was quietly listed for sale last month. As for Vivian, she incredibly didn't get fired, but the damage to her professional reputation was absolute and permanent. The firm's strict internal audit uncovered years of highly questionable hospitality expenses. She was permanently stripped of her corporate card, formally demoted from her management track, and heavily reassigned to a low-level desk job analyzing market data in a windowless office. The massive promotion she had desperately bragged about went directly to a younger, much more competent woman. The glamorous, influencer-heavy lifestyle she had built entirely using my credit line completely evaporated overnight. I haven't spoken a single word to either of them since I closed my apartment door that night. I didn't officially block their phone numbers. I simply stopped answering, letting their occasional, pathetic, desperate voicemails echo quietly into the void until they eventually gave up completely. Right now, I am sitting in my small, quiet apartment in Boston. The radiator in the corner is still clanking slightly, but it really doesn't bother me anymore. I have a warm cup of chamomile tea in my hands, and the early spring sunlight is finally streaming brightly through my windows, warming the floorboards. I honestly thought that cutting off my own bloodline would eventually leave me feeling incredibly empty or deeply guilty. Society constantly drills it into our heads that family is absolutely everything, that you must forgive highly toxic behavior simply because you happen to share the same DNA. But sitting here today, watching the dust motes dance in the sunlight, I don't feel empty at all. I feel incredibly light. I finally realized that true family isn't determined by blood. It is strictly determined by mutual respect, by unwavering support, and by the people who recognize your true value without needing you to constantly prove it to them. When the people who are supposed to love you only keep you around to use you as a financial buffer and an emotional punching bag, walking away isn't an act of betrayal. It is a necessary act of profound self-preservation. When the people using you can no longer extract value from your pain, they will aggressively call you a traitor. But in reality, that is the exact moment you finally find your true freedom. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I hope this resonated with you in some way, especially if you've ever felt like the designated scapegoat in your own family dynamic. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation where you finally had to cut the cord on toxic relatives who were using you? Let me know your experiences down in the comments. I read every single one of them. Now, if you made it all the way to the very end of this video, you are officially part of what I like to call the 1% Club. I have a special request just for you. Drop the letter W in the comments below. It stands for winner. It's our secret sign to recognize the incredible, resilient people who watched this entire journey and understand the true value of walking away from toxicity. If my story helped you, or if you just love a good comeback, please hit that like button and follow the channel. We have a lot more stories to share, and I'd love to have you along for the ride. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.